July 20th, 1944, White Sands, Proving Ground, New Mexico. The roar of the V-2 rocket is deafening as it streaks toward the desert sky. The engineers below barely flinch. The ground trembles underfoot. The engineers, faces grim and caked with dust, adjust their heavy, sweat-streaked goggles. The metal monstrosity, stripped of its German insignia, stands at the launch pad, pointing towards the heavens, but its origins are unmistakable. The first V-2 test in the hands of the Americans, captured after the fall of Germany, is about to prove something far more dangerous than anyone anticipates. An explosive liftoff, followed by a trail of fire and smoke, sends the engineers scrambling to ensure nothing explodes prematurely. In that chaos, one engineer, his hand on the control lever, has an epiphany. He knows this is it. As the rocket climbs and the sound dulls into nothingness, a radio crackles to life. The telemetry feed returns a result. For the first time in history, the US has reached a new frontier, and they don't even realize yet how far it will take them. The air is thick with dust and anticipation on that July morning in 1944. Major Charles Chuck Baker, a tall, square-jawed man in his 40s, steps off the C-47 transport plane onto the tarmac at White Sands. His boots sink into the hot New Mexico sand with each step. He's here for a purpose, a mission that could change the course of history. The US government has tasked him with overseeing the operation to reverse engineer German technology, particularly their infamous V-2 rockets. The heat shimmers across the proving ground, distorting the hangar buildings in the distance. Baker carries a leather briefcase containing classified orders and technical specifications translated from captured German documents. Lieutenant Sarah Collins, a young engineer with sharp eyes and an iron grip, waits near the transport vehicles. She's already covered in sweat, her uniform a little too loose around her shoulders from weeks of work in the desert heat. "Welcome to White Sands, Major," she says, extending her hand. The grip is firm, professional. Chuck shakes her hand, but then turns his gaze toward the hangar complex. Inside those metal buildings, the rockets stand silent, ominous. German engineers built them to devastate London, to change the war's momentum overseas. But here, under the blistering southwestern sun, these machines represent the key to unlocking new frontiers. The sand crunches beneath their boots as they walk toward the main facility. Inside the primary hangar, Sarah walks him through the first few days of the operation. "It's a mess," she says, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "We can barely make sense of their blueprints. No one really knows how these things work. The walls are plastered with tangled diagrams, hastily scribbled equations, and half-completed schematics. A few of the captured German engineers stand in the corner, eyes darting nervously, as if they know the Americans don't trust them. Their expertise is essential. But the political situation remains delicate." Chuck nods slowly, then looks over at the V-2s resting on their transport cradles. The rockets gleam dully in the artificial light. "We're here to figure this out," he says firmly. "And we will." Records would later show that Baker had worked on artillery development before this assignment, but rocket propulsion represented an entirely new challenge. After weeks of confusion and stalled progress through late July and into August 1944, the first V-2 rocket is finally prepared for launch. The engineers are nervous. They've never seen anything quite like this system, even with all the experience they've accumulated with conventional US rockets and artillery. There are too many variables, too many unknowns in the propulsion mechanics. The fuel mixture ratios remain uncertain despite weeks of calculations. Chuck stands at the launch site on the morning of August 12th, a radio headset in place, sweating in the scorching sun. The temperature already exceeds 95 degrees before 9 o'clock. Ready for launch, Major, Sarah calls out from the concrete control bunker 200 yards from the pad. Her voice crackles through the radio with slight static interference. The sound of the rocket's turbo pumps spooling up echoes across the desert floor. The engineers' eyes widen, their hearts pounding as systems activate in sequence. The countdown begins according to the translated German procedures. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A mechanical roar, the rumbling of steel on steel as fuel valves open. The V-2's engine ignites in a flash of blue-white fire. The rocket lifts slowly at first, then accelerates rapidly. The ground shakes beneath their boots with surprising violence, and they watch it ascend into the cloudless sky. The roar of the engine almost drowns out Chuck's thoughts, but he knows this moment's significance. This could be the breakthrough, the technology that will outpace any enemy nation's capabilities. A moment of disbelief and wonder fills the air as engineers shield their eyes against the brilliant exhaust flame. The American military now holds Germany's future in their hands, repurposed for new objectives. But then, 38 seconds into flight, the telemetry report crashes through the speakers. The rocket veers off course, climbing far beyond the intended altitude before control is lost. The trajectory is all wrong, according to the predicted flight path. "Damn it," Chuck curses as the rocket tumbles and falls back to Earth in a violent crash 15 miles downrange, sending a column of dust into the sky. There's silence in the control bunker before the facility erupts into a flurry of frantic activity. Engineers check their instruments and review the telemetry data. For now, the failure has been spectacular, expensive, and deeply troubling. But Chuck's resolve only hardens as he studies the numbers. "We try again," he mutters to Sarah over the radio link. "We learn from this." The explosion from the V-2's failure still lingers in their ears days later. But there's a new tension in the air at White Sands by mid-September 1944. Chuck, now working long hours in his field office, looks over the telemetry reports repeatedly. Something doesn't sit right with the data patterns. The engine's generated thrust levels too powerful for what's being reported in the flight characteristics. The guidance mechanisms inside the rocket are too complex, too sophisticated to fail this easily without explanation. Sarah enters one evening as the sun sets over the mountains, eyes tired but full of purpose. "I've been thinking about the guidance systems," she says, leaning over his desk cluttered with papers and slide rules. "Maybe it's not about the rocket itself, but the way it's being steered. We keep missing something fundamental in the gyroscope calibration." Chuck stares at the blueprint spread in front of him, the German annotations still visible in the margins. There's a faint noise, the scrape of a pencil on paper as he marks potential correction factors. "And if we can crack that particular problem?" he asks quietly, not looking up from the calculations. Sarah looks up toward the window where darkness is falling. "If we can crack that, we could be looking at something bigger than just military rockets. We could be looking at reaching significant altitude, maybe even the edge of space itself." The realization dawns on both of them slowly, like the first light of dawn over the desert. The rockets aren't just weapons of war. They're the first step into something much greater than anyone has articulated. But to get there, they'll have to unlock the technology's potential piece by piece, trial by trial, failure by failure. The German engineers have been more cooperative lately, explaining the finer points of the guidance platform, but trust remains an issue. The tension shifts in the room. Chuck's mind races through possibilities and constraints. "Let's get to work," he says finally. Records from that month show increased requisitions for precision instruments and gyroscope components. The team worked through the night on multiple occasions, refining their understanding of the control systems. By late September, they had identified 3 critical errors in their calibration procedures. Weeks of trials through October 1944 bring another V-2 test launch, and once again, something goes catastrophically wrong. The rocket explodes mid-air at 41 seconds into flight, sending fragments raining down into the desert in a pattern stretching nearly 2 miles. This time, the engineers are more prepared for the failure. Protective bunkers have been reinforced and safety protocols improved. But it doesn't make the setback easier to accept. The weight of their task, to make something operational from these captured machines, hangs heavy on everyone involved. Chuck watches the debris scattered across the sand from the observation post, feeling the pressure mount from Washington. There's a quiet anger in his chest, frustration at the persistent technical challenges. "We need a breakthrough. Now," he says to no one in particular. Sarah stands beside him, weary but determined after another sleepless night. "It's the fuel system," she says after some thought, reviewing her notes in the morning light. "We've misjudged the ethanol-oxygen mixture ratio. It's creating unstable combustion at high altitudes where atmospheric pressure drops." It's a relatively minor adjustment in theory, but to them, it feels like the key to unlocking everything they've struggled with. They work late into the night for the next 2 weeks, tuning the fuel systems, recalibrating the engines with painstaking precision. There's no room for mistakes anymore. The program's continuation depends on demonstrable progress. Engineers measure and remeasure, check and recheck every calculation. The German advisors suggest modifications based on their Peenemünde experience, and gradually the pieces come together. By month's end, they've prepared another rocket with the corrected fuel mixture, improved guidance, calibration, and reinforced structural supports. The October heat has given way to cooler autumn temperatures, making the work somewhat more bearable. The morning of November 18, 1944, Chuck stands at the edge of the launch pad, eyes narrowed against the sun rising over the mountains. The V-2 stands ready on its launch platform, now with the newly adjusted fuel systems and recalibrated guidance package. The engineers are quiet, each knowing the stakes of this attempt. There are no more chances for repeated failure. Funding and patience from military leadership are not infinite. "Ready for launch," Sarah says over the radio, her voice steady, but there's a flicker of hope in her eyes that wasn't present before. She won't admit it openly, but she's ready for the success that could validate months of grueling work and make history. The countdown begins according to the refined procedures. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. The rocket roars to life with a sound that reverberates across the entire proving ground. And this time, it doesn't fail. The V-2 rockets upward, straight and true, as the engineers watch in stunned silence from their positions. The trajectory is perfect according to the tracking instruments. The telemetry confirms it moment by moment as the rocket climbs. The rocket's flight path matches the predicted curve almost exactly. The guidance system is working as designed. The fuel mixture burns smoothly, propelling the vehicle higher and higher. This is what they've been waiting for through months of setbacks and doubts. The rocket reaches an altitude of 53 miles before the fuel is exhausted and it begins its ballistic descent. Chuck doesn't let himself smile, he simply nods once, acknowledging the success. This is the moment everything changes. Records from that day show the telemetry data was immediately classified and sent to Washington. The successful test validated the entire program's approach. Chuck and Sarah stand in front of the recovered rocket components 2 days later, now safely back at the facility after retrieval teams collected them from the desert. They both feel the weight of what they've accomplished, but also the immensity of what lies ahead. Sarah turns to him, a smile breaking through her usually serious expression. "We've done it, Major. We've actually done it." Chuck nods, eyes still fixed on the scorched metal of the rocket's skin, blackened from atmospheric re-entry. But his thoughts are elsewhere now, racing ahead to implications beyond the immediate military applications. The next step is no longer just about rockets as weapons. It's about reaching altitudes no human has ever achieved, about understanding what lies beyond Earth's atmosphere. December 1944 brings colder weather to New Mexico and a new sense of purpose to the program. The successful test has energized the entire team. Washington has taken notice, and funding authorizations arrive with greater speed. Chuck spends long hours in his office, drafting reports and proposals that extend far beyond the original mission parameters. He writes about atmospheric research, about the possibility of observing Earth from unprecedented heights, about scientific instruments that could be carried to the edge of space itself. Sarah reviews these documents with growing excitement. The technical challenges remain formidable, but they now have proof that solutions are possible. The German engineers, sensing the shift in momentum, become more forthcoming with their knowledge. Conversations that were once guarded become genuine technical exchanges. Trust, slowly, begins to develop between former enemies united by scientific curiosity. By mid-December, plans are being drawn up for a series of additional test launches, each designed to push the boundaries further. The V-2 technology, once intended solely for destruction, is being reimagined as a tool for exploration and discovery. Plans are drawn up through January 1945, with increasing detail and ambition. Blueprints of the V-2 are spread across the desks in the war room, annotated with proposed modifications and improvements. Chuck and Sarah begin to speak openly of space, not just missiles and military applications, but what comes next for human knowledge and capability. The shift in their thinking is clear to everyone on the team. They're not only trying to make America the military powerhouse of the world, they're trying to position the nation as the dominant force in whatever comes after the war ends. The conversations grow more technical and more visionary simultaneously. Sarah sketches ideas for payload compartments that could carry scientific instruments instead of warheads. Chuck discusses trajectory calculations that could maximize altitude and data collection. Engineers debate materials that could withstand the extreme temperatures of high-altitude flight and re-entry. The German advisors contribute insights from their years of research at Peenemünde, knowledge that would have remained locked behind enemy lines without this unexpected collaboration. They don't say it aloud in official meetings, but they all know this will take decades to fully realize, but the foundation is being laid now. Washington receives their reports with growing interest. The potential for post-war applications becomes increasingly apparent to military planners and civilian officials alike. By late January, authorization arrives for an expanded program. More rockets, more tests, more ambitious objectives. The proving ground at White Sands will become a permanent facility, not just a temporary wartime installation. Additional personnel are requisitioned. Budget allocations increase. The work that began as an emergency effort to understand enemy technology is transforming into something entirely different, a long-term investment in America's technological future. Records from that period show requisitions for specialized tracking equipment, high-altitude photography systems, and atmospheric sensors. A change is in the air by February 1945, palpable to everyone at White Sands. The war in Europe is clearly approaching its final phase, but for Chuck, Sarah, and their team, the true battle is just beginning. Not a military battle, but a scientific and technological one. They send their findings to Washington in detailed reports that emphasize both immediate military value and long-term strategic importance. The V-2 technology, they argue persuasively, will be the springboard for the United States' entry into whatever competition follows the war. They may have begun with a captured enemy weapon, but now they've unlocked something far more significant, the key to the stars, as Sarah puts it in a private conversation. The successful tests continue through February. On the 7th, another rocket reaches 58 miles. On the 23rd, they achieve 61 miles, with improved telemetry systems. Each launch provides more data, more understanding, more confidence. The engineers work with increasing efficiency, their procedures now refined through hard experience. Chuck stands at the observation post during one evening launch, watching the rocket's exhaust flame trace a brilliant line against the darkening sky. He thinks about what this means beyond the immediate technical achievement. Other nations will pursue this capability. The Soviet Union, now emerging as America's rival in the post-war world, has captured German rocket facilities in their occupation zone. Intelligence reports suggest they're conducting similar recovery and testing operations. The race has already begun, though few people recognize it yet. Sarah joins him at the observation post as the rocket disappears from view. "We're ahead right now," she says quietly. "But we need to stay ahead." Chuck nods. The geopolitical implications are becoming clearer with each passing week. This isn't just about rockets anymore, it's about national prestige, scientific leadership, and strategic advantage in a world being rapidly reshaped by the war's end. The end of World War II in Europe on May 8, 1945 brings new urgency rather than relief to the program. The Soviet Union, now occupying eastern Germany, has captured the main Peenemünde rocket facility and taken control of production sites in their zone. Intelligence reports reaching White Sands in March indicate Soviet efforts to recruit German engineers and transport equipment eastward. The US is in a race that's shifting from military to ideological terms. Chuck and Sarah watch as the V-2 program becomes part of the broader Cold War effort that's emerging even before the hot war has fully concluded. Their work has moved from experimental engineering to strategic maneuvering with geopolitical consequences. Chuck stands in front of his expanded team one morning in late March, his expression serious. "We're at the forefront of something that will define the coming decades. There's no turning back now, and there's no room for complacency." The team understands. They're no longer just engineers solving technical problems. They're participants in a long-term competition for technological supremacy. Additional German scientists have been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, providing deeper expertise in rocket propulsion and guidance systems. The knowledge transfer accelerates dramatically. Werner von Braun himself arrives at White Sands in March, and his presence transforms the program's capabilities. His insights into advanced designs and theoretical possibilities open new avenues of research. The launches continue with increasing sophistication. By April, they're testing rockets with scientific instrument packages, collecting atmospheric data at altitudes impossible to reach by any other means. The information gathered contributes to meteorology, physics, and astronomy. Each successful test demonstrates American capability and adds to the growing body of knowledge about high-altitude flight. Records from this period show a dramatic increase in both the frequency of launches and the complexity of the missions. The proving ground expands with additional facilities and support infrastructure. What began as a small operation has grown into a substantial program with national significance. As America and the Soviet Union face off in the emerging Cold War, through April and May 1945, Chuck and Sarah know they're part of the greatest technological challenge of the century. The competition isn't openly acknowledged yet in diplomatic channels, but it's very real in research facilities and proving grounds. The world watches, or at least the portions of the world with access to information, as rockets lift into the sky with increasing frequency, aiming ever higher. The V-2 wasn't the final answer, they understand clearly now, but it was the start of something much bigger than anyone initially imagined. The technology is already being surpassed by new designs. American engineers are developing indigenous rocket systems, incorporating lessons learned from the German technology, but pushing beyond its limitations. The May tests include experimental engine configurations that produce greater thrust. New fuel combinations are tested. Guidance systems become more sophisticated and reliable. Chuck reviews proposals for multi-stage rockets that could reach even higher altitudes by shedding weight as fuel is consumed. The concepts are ambitious, perhaps years away from realization, but the theoretical groundwork is being laid. Sarah leads a team focused on payload optimization, determining how to maximize the scientific and potential military value of each flight. The Soviet Union conducts its first V-2 test launch using captured German rockets in their territory, according to intelligence reports reaching White Sands. The competition is now undeniable and public, though both sides maintain a veneer of scientific research rather than military development. Chuck and Sarah discuss the implications during a late evening meeting in May. They'll catch up to us in the short term, Chuck acknowledges, but if we maintain our momentum, if we continue innovating, we can stay ahead in the long term. The conversation turns to what comes next, not just in the next year, but in the next decade, the next generation. They talk about satellites, about crewed flights, about missions beyond Earth's atmosphere. It sounds like science fiction, but the mathematics and engineering principles are sound. It's just a matter of time, resources, and determination. Years would pass, but the foundation laid at White Sands in those crucial months of 1944 and 1945 shaped everything that followed. Chuck, now promoted to colonel by June 1945, reflects on the work he and Sarah started during those intense early days. The American space program that would eventually send men to the moon had its origins in the desert of New Mexico, in the hands of engineers who took captured enemy technology and transformed it into something entirely new. He watches a rocket launch from his front porch years later, the hum of the engines a familiar sound that brings back memories. The rockets are larger now, more powerful, more sophisticated than those first V-2s that barely made it off the pad. But the fundamental principles remain the same: controlled combustion, precise guidance, structural integrity under extreme stress. He thinks about the quiet days at White Sands, about the failures that taught them as much as the successes, about the long nights spent calculating and recalculating trajectories. He remembers Sarah's determination, the German engineers' grudging cooperation that became genuine partnership, the moment when a rocket finally flew true and everything changed. "This is what we built," he says, not just to Sarah, who stands beside him, but to himself and to history. The legacy of those early tests extends far beyond what anyone anticipated. The technology developed at White Sands contributed to weather forecasting, communications satellites, Earth observation systems, and eventually human spaceflight. Records preserved in archives show the progression from those crude early tests to increasingly sophisticated missions, each launch built on the knowledge gained from previous attempts. Each failure was analyzed, understood, and overcome. The human cost was measured in exhaustion and stress rather than casualties. Though there were close calls and dangerous moments, the financial cost was substantial but justified by the results. The strategic cost to America's rivals was incalculable, a technological lead that would persist for decades. Chuck and Sarah retire from active duty in the following years, their work now largely complete. The program they helped establish has taken on a life of its own, growing far beyond what two individuals could control or even fully comprehend. Their names aren't famous, appearing only in classified reports and technical journals. The public knows about the rockets and the space program, but not necessarily about the specific contributions of individual engineers who made it possible. Yet their contribution to the future of humanity is undeniable to those who know the history. The legacy of their V-2 tests at White Sands has pushed America to the forefront of space exploration and kept it there through determined effort and continuous innovation. The proving ground they helped establish continues operations decades later, still testing new technologies and pushing boundaries. Chuck receives occasional letters from former colleagues, updating him on new developments. He learns about satellite launches, about probes sent to other planets, about plans for permanent space stations. Each achievement traces back, in some way, to those early days in 1944 and 1945, when they were just trying to make a captured German rocket fly properly. Sarah continues consulting work for several years after retirement, her expertise in guidance systems still valuable. She publishes technical papers under security restrictions, contributing to the body of knowledge available to future engineers. Their paths diverge geographically, but they maintain correspondence, occasionally reminiscing about the challenges they overcame and the future they helped create. The quiet victory they achieved wasn't celebrated with parades or public recognition. It was recorded in test reports, telemetry data, and budget authorizations. It was preserved in the rockets that followed, each one better than the last. It was secured in America's technological leadership and strategic advantage during the Cold War, decades. Records show that the White Sands program conducted hundreds of test launches in the years following their initial successes, each contributing incrementally to human knowledge and capability. A final note, preserved in the National Archives among thousands of other documents from that era, captures the essence of what was accomplished. The telegram sent from White Sands to Washington in July 1945 reads simply, "The future of space exploration is owed to the work of engineers who tested the V-2. They set us on a path that will take us to the stars. The language is restrained, bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. Something fundamental had changed during those months of testing and failure and eventual success. The boundary between Earth and space, once absolute and insurmountable, had become permeable. Human beings had reached the edge of the atmosphere and looked beyond it. The technology to go further existed and would only improve. The implications were understood by a small group of military officials, scientists, and engineers in 1945, but it would take years for the broader public to grasp what had begun. When Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth in 1961, many people saw it as a sudden achievement. In reality, it was the culmination of work that started decades earlier in places like White Sands. When American astronauts landed on the Moon in 1969, the direct lineage back to those early V-2 tests was clear to anyone who studied the history. Chuck Baker passed away in the 1970s, living long enough to see men walk on the lunar surface. Sarah Collins continued her work into the 1980s, witnessing the Space Shuttle program and the expansion of satellite technology into commercial and civilian applications. They both knew that what they had helped start was far from finished. The exploration of space would continue for generations, perhaps forever. The files from the White Sands program, gradually declassified over the decades, tell the story in technical language and precise data. The rockets flew. The altitude was reached. The knowledge was gained. The future was secured. In the archives, the numbers and reports speak for themselves. The legacy endures.